Most people view betrayal as an emotional crisis. A strategist views it as a structural flaw. When you discover a breach of contract in your personal life, you don't make a scene. You compile the data, minimize your exposure, and clear the board. Welcome back to the archive. I'm Jess, and today we examine the mathematical precision of a coordinated exit strategy. When a man discovered his wife was using her family as an alibi to cover an ongoing affair, he didn't confront her. Instead, he hired a professional, mapped out the structural vulnerabilities of the man involved, and delivered 2 envelopes on the exact same morning. Let's look at the ledger. I grew up watching my parents destroy each other in slow motion. Infidelity was the instrument, but the real damage was in the years of pretending. The ambient dishonesty that children absorb without having the vocabulary to name it. I made a quiet decision very early in my life that I would not replicate that environment. I mention this not as preamble, but as context for everything that followed. I did not act out of anger. I acted out of a long-held and carefully considered principle. The first signal was logistical. My children, 4 and 6 at the time, began mentioning their maternal grandparents with a frequency that didn't match the geometry of the situation. 90 minutes each direction. 2, sometimes 3 times a week. I ran the numbers the way I ran any numbers. Quietly, without announcing I was doing it. When I raised it with my wife, her answer was smooth, but her delivery wasn't. I had known her long enough to understand the difference. So I began tracking the odometer on her car. Not with any particular drama. I simply wrote down the reading each morning and each evening and let the data accumulate. Within 2 weeks, I had an unexplained surplus of roughly 400 miles. She was going somewhere she wasn't telling me about, with a regularity that suggested habit rather than occasion. Then she left her AOL password on a sticky note next to the keyboard. I have thought about that moment many times since. I do not believe it was entirely accidental. But I read the emails regardless, and what I found confirmed what the mileage had already implied. I printed the relevant exchanges, filed them in a manila folder, and said nothing. I had confirmation, but confirmation, on its own, is only the beginning of a case. I have always believed in hiring the right person for a given task, rather than attempting competence in areas where I have none. Investigation is a discipline. I am not an investigator. A friend who worked in law enforcement pointed me toward someone who had left the force to work privately. I will call him Ron. And within a week of our first meeting, I understood why he had been recommended without qualification. I gave Ron the printed emails, the mileage records, and the limited geography I had pieced together. He did not require much more than that. What he produced over the following weeks was a report of the sort that removes all remaining ambiguity from a situation. Photographs, timestamps, specific locations. The pattern was consistent and well established. My wife would drop the children with her parents, drive to meet a man I did not yet know by name, share a meal with him, and then accompany him to a motel for the better part of the afternoon, after which she would collect our children and return home in time for dinner. I read the report once thoroughly, and then I set it aside. I contacted a divorce attorney the following morning. My parents' choices had fractured something in my childhood that never fully repaired, and I had decided long before this moment that I would not negotiate with that particular kind of betrayal. The decision, when it arrived, was less painful than I had anticipated. It felt less like a rupture, and more like the conclusion of a proof I had been working through for some time. But the report contained one additional detail that I had not anticipated, and which changed the shape of what I was planning. The man in the photographs had a name, a family, and a professional situation that was, from a certain angle, quite structurally fragile. I asked Ron to go one layer deeper. What he came back with was this: the man, I will call him Bob, was married with 3 children. He held the title of vice president of sales at a company that belonged, in the most material sense, to his father-in-law. The house where his family lived was also owned by his wife's parents. His entire professional and domestic architecture rested on a foundation of his in-laws' continued goodwill. I noted this with the same neutral attention I would give to any relevant variable. I asked Ron for 2 additional copies of his full report. Then I asked him to do one more thing. On the same morning my wife was served with divorce papers at her place of work, Ron drove to Bob's wife's home and handed her the second envelope in person. I had thought about this decision carefully. She had 3 children. She was, by every account Ron had assembled, entirely unaware of what her husband had been doing. Whatever structural consequences followed from the information were, in my estimation, consequences that Bob had authored for himself over a significant period of time. I was not engineering her circumstances. I was simply ensuring that she had access to the same facts I did. What she chose to do with them was entirely her own business. I went back to work. I focused on my children. I did not monitor what came next, not because I was indifferent, but because my involvement in that chapter was complete. I had done what I set out to do, and I had done it in a single coordinated morning. I would not learn the full extent of what followed until much later, and when I did, I found that I felt almost nothing about it, which told me something about how thoroughly I had already closed that account. The publicly available court records from Bob's divorce were, by any measure, comprehensive. His wife had moved quickly and precisely. Joint accounts emptied, children removed, residence surrendered back to her parents within days of Ron's visit. Her father, upon learning what Bob had done with the goodwill extended to him, terminated his employment. The eviction followed logically from there. What came after was considerably less orderly. Escalating disputes, police involvement, a broken-nosed courtesy of his brother-in-law, restraining orders, criminal proceedings. The kind of cascading institutional consequences that tend to accumulate when a person makes a series of poor decisions and then handles the exposure poorly as well. I did not search for any of this deliberately. It surfaced through the ordinary channels of a small world over the years. The last information I had was that Bob had relocated out of state. He does not appear to exist on the internet in any findable form. His ex-wife, by contrast, eventually took over her father's company after he retired. I found that detail quietly satisfying in the way that outcomes sometimes are when they reflect a kind of structural fairness. As for my own life, my ex-wife and I maintained a functional co-parenting arrangement for as long as the children required one. I kept every interaction scoped to what was relevant and necessary. Now that my children are adults, there is no architecture left that requires maintenance. I bear her no particular animosity. She is significant to me only in the way that she is significant to them. I closed that chapter the morning the papers were served. Everything since has been a different book entirely. I learned a long time ago that the goal is never the satisfaction of watching things fall apart. The goal is simply to ensure that when you walk away, you have left nothing unfinished behind you. The protagonist of this file understood a fundamental law of dark psychology. You don't need to punish your enemies yourself. You simply need to hand the truth to the people who are currently financing their illusions. Bob didn't lose his job, his house, and his family because of a vindictive plot. He lost them because his entire life was a house of cards, and someone finally opened the window. The goal is never the chaotic satisfaction of watching things fall apart. The goal is leaving nothing unfinished. You have completed today's briefing. If you are ready to study the next tactical blueprint in our database, select the file on your screen now. The archive never sleeps.